there's a lot of stonewalling going on today, and it's going on down in the Gulf of Mexico, and we all know what that nightmare is. And George, I think there's another big player in this whole corrupt abuse of stewardship, hell, lack of stewardship, just total non-caring, and in my opinion, definite misuse of taxpayer dollars, if not just downright theft of taxpayer dollars, maybe on an end around, but they're getting us. And there's another player in this gig. You want to talk about that?
Let me put it this way: is the problems with a wild horse program is sort of a symptom. It's symbolic of what is wrong with the Department of Interior, how it is controlled by the industries that it's supposed to regulate, the agriculture industry being one. But big beef, big cattle is nothing compared to big oil and gas. Public lands are a treasure trove of oil and gas deposits, and big oil has made sure that it exerts its influence every step of the way in getting its share. I wish the public would do the same, but that's not the case. The fact is that oil and gas leasing revenue on public lands is the second biggest source of income for the federal government after taxes. Wow. I mean, it's an amazing pile of money that's generated by this. It probably should be a lot more, because the oil industry locks up tens of millions of acres, leases it for a pittance from the government, does as little drilling on land as possible, and goes out and does instead riskier offshore stuff. That's not forced out there by environmentalists, as I think some would like to contend. That's their choice. Nevada is a perfect example of that. We have a couple of million acres here that are leased out for oil and gas exploration. 99% of those acres are undeveloped, not drilled, not tapped, whatever. A perfect example of the kind of money and corruption we're talking about is the story of the MMS, the Minerals Management Service, within the Department of Interior. This agency is supposed to keep an eye on oil and gas leasing, to not only decide who gets the leases, but also to monitor the royalties, the revenue that comes in. In 2008, this story exploded. I don't think Americans remember this very well, but MMS, which is supposed to oversee the likes of BP, and does, theoretically,
more ways than one,
was busted. Wide open. The Inspector General had been hearing these reports about MMS, as I had for a lot of years as well, about how cozy they were with the oil and gas industry, whether they were in bed with them. Well, they were in bed with them, literally.
Where they found that a culture where the acceptance of gifts from oil and gas companies were widespread throughout the office of the Lake Charles District Mineral Management Service in Louisiana.
What came out is the Inspector General looked into the Denver office that was coordinating all these programs, billions of dollars worth of leases that were under their purview. These were the office itself was staffed by people who had worked in the oil industry, come to the government, gone back to the oil industry. Some of the people in this office were, as they're working for the taxpayers, were also on the side doing consulting for the oil and gas industry, taking money. They accepted gifts. They accepted free trips abroad. Some of them were being paid off in drugs. They were having sex parties. I mean, literally in bed with the oil industry. It was a major scandal that the Inspector General described as a culture of substance abuse and promiscuity by this group of individuals. Now, they were fired. It was supposedly all cleaned up, but it's a major scandal, and I think it's indicative of the kinds of relationships that existed then and now. Now, the guy who's now in charge of the MMS is somebody that I know pretty well. His name is Bob Abbey, and for many years he was the head of the Nevada office of the BLM. And then he was moved to Washington in the Obama administration. He became head of the national BLM, overseeing the wild horse program and a lot more. Well, after the BP scandal recently broke, the disaster in the Gulf, they moved Bob Abbey over to MMS, figuring he's a steady hand, will have control there. If you're worried about BLM and its relationships, and MMS and its relationships with big oil, in particular with BP, Bob Abbey may not be the guy to go into that job. Now, I interviewed him several times. I think he's a fairly ethical guy. I don't agree with how he treated wild horses while he was here, but there are some question marks about his tenure here, and I'll give you an example. There is a gigantic copper mine, a pit, that is outside a town called Yerington, Nevada. And it was basically abandoned. It's a gigantic hole, fills up with water. It's so deep that the groundwater rises up in it. It's like a mini lake. The groundwater is poison. It's toxic. There's uranium in that soil, and the radiation levels are so high that really that mine should be considered a Superfund site. Bob Abbey, when he was head of the Nevada BLM office, resisted that. And the reason is because the businessmen in that area were concerned that if you call this a Superfund site, it's bad for our image out here. Who's going to want to move to Yerington if they think it's like the next Love Canal? So they resisted it. They also, the state of Nevada's environmental division also resisted it. But there was a guy there working for BLM at that time named Earl Dixon who couldn't stand it. He knew that there were internal documents and studies that had been done showing that the uranium in that mine had leached into the groundwater and was a danger to the thousands of people who lived in that area. It was elevated radiation risks, cancer risks, and it was being suppressed. So he came forward and was a whistleblower and let all this information out. Bob Abbey fired him.
Wow.
The guy went to court, filed a whistleblower suit. He won. He was right. That information should have been made public. That site is still sitting there, still leaching radiation into the ground. And guess who owns it? BP.
Unbelievable.
Now, BP hides. It has no fingerprints on it. It says, oh, that's owned by ARCO. But who owns ARCO? It's BP. That's a perfect example of BP influence. And I'll give you another one. When Bob Abbey was moved from head of the BLM to head MMS a couple of weeks ago, the lady who replaced him as the temporary director is named Sylvia Baca. Sylvia had worked for the Department of Interior years ago, and her job was to oversee leasing and offshore areas like the Gulf of Mexico to make sure that the proper safety, that the leasing was done properly, that royalties were collected, that the proper safety gear and plan of action was put into place. She left the government, however, and went to work for BP as a senior management consultant, senior vice president. That was then. Now she's back at the Department of Interior and has been appointed to head the BLM again. So it's a revolving door. You would see examples of people who work for the government and go back and forth between the oil and gas industry, and it's no wonder that the Department of Interior basically does whatever the oil industry tells them. Now, you've got guys like Ken Salazar now talking tough. Boy, we're going to crack down. We're going to get to the bottom of this. I'm not sure that I trust Ken Salazar to do that. Ken Salazar is, before he became a senator, before he became Secretary of the Interior, was a cattle rancher. I know what he's, getting back to the wild horse program, I know what he has said about horses. Wild horses have no place on public range. They have no place there, despite the fact that that's what the law of the land is, that they belong out there. Ken Salazar has the same view of public lands that Bush and Cheney had for all those years. The public lands are for the public of oil companies, mining companies, and cattle companies. That's the public they serve. Those lands are there to be exploited. And the American public gets ripped off every single day, every year, to the tunes of billions of dollars. We have this image of oil men and gas men, wildcatters, and the miners, and the rugged individualists, the cattlemen who tamed the West. It's a bunch of crap. All those guys exist because they suck off the public teat. They are welfare, it's corporate welfare, or they wouldn't exist.
You know, George, back when you were interviewing and doing the first of several series of stories that you've done on this, there was a pipeline that really wasn't on the radar yet. It came up on the radar pretty recently. As a matter of fact, it really came up on the radar during our phone conversations the last few days leading up to this interview. But what kind of lead us into that, and then we'll see what comes out of that.
Well, we had the Calico roundup at the end of last year and into the first part of this year, and you know, it's in the middle of nowhere, as I said before, 500,000 acres, not that many horses, there's nothing out there. What the heck is the impetus for this thing? Well, the BLM doesn't need an impetus. You know, they'll round them up just for practice to get the horses off the range and maybe let some more cattle out there. But in this case, the wild horse advocates started asking questions about it, and they realized, they started seeing the news releases about the Ruby pipeline. 675 miles planned, a $3 billion project, 42-inch pipe that they were going to build from Wyoming through Utah, Nevada, and California and up into Oregon. And they said, well, gosh, it goes right through the Calico Range where they've just removed all these horses. Could this have something to do with it? So they started poking around, people like Cindy McDonald and others. And they found the documents that show, in fact, there was a connection, that there were discussions between BLM and the contractor, El Paso Natural Gas, about the impact on wild horses, and that they would need to make provisions for the wild horses. They also what surfaced were some statements, some inflammatory statements by project managers for El Paso Natural Gas about what the effect of this pipeline's construction would be, not only to horses, but in the natural habitat. He said, it's going to be really nasty, it's going to be ugly, it's going to be like Hiroshima out there, which after a while, the wild horse people started putting this 2 and 2 together, and they said, we think that maybe the reason those horses had to go is so that pipeline can go there, and we wouldn't be out there raising hell about it. Now, whether there's a smoking gun, it sure looks like it. BLM has said, no, it has nothing to do with it. We didn't consider the wild horses when we approved the Ruby pipeline. I don't know what's worse. You know, I don't know what's worse, that they wouldn't think about the impact of a 42-inch, 670-mile pipeline on wild horses and other wildlife, that they didn't even consider it, or that they secretly were co-opted by the industry and were cooperating with them off the record.
Yeah, you know, just based on the facts that we have, in my humble opinion, there's very little doubt in my mind what the real deal here is with the Ruby pipeline. And after you and I discussed it, I did a little digging of my own. You're not going to believe who the number 2 beneficiary of this pipeline is going to be. You're not going to believe who is already contracted to push their products through this pipeline. Well, you are going to believe it because they've been involved in the federal government in the state of Nevada, the state government in Nevada, in several other states all over the country, and they are our friends at British Petroleum. Yep, the people who brought us the devastation of the fishing culture on the Gulf Coast of America are the second biggest organization involved in this Ruby pipeline. Now, George, you've been looking at this mess for years, decades. When I tell you that BP is a big player, the second biggest player in this pipeline, what does that say to you?
Well, I'm both astonished and not surprised. Astonished that you were able to find it, because I've been looking for a possible connection and haven't been able to find one. They've kept it really low key. I mean, I don't know how you found the contract, but we could not find that in any public sources. So I guess it's now out in the public. I'm surprised that they were involved in pushing the Ruby pipeline, but not really. If you look at BP's history, BP and El Paso go way back. There was another pipeline that goes all the way from Tennessee down to, coincidentally, the Gulf of Mexico, a gas pipeline. That they were in business together. I think BP bought out El Paso. El Paso, by the way, which has promised the people of Nevada and the people of the West, don't worry about this Ruby pipeline. We're going to take care of you. We'll take care of the wildlife. We'll protect the environment. We'll be good corporate citizens. You can trust us. Well, I'm not so sure that that's true. Number one, your partner is BP in this, and we know how much we can trust them after the disaster in the Gulf. That gets worse every day. Number two is, just look at recent history for El Paso. Their chief of their minerals division was sentenced to 14 years in prison back in December, just a couple of months ago, for artificially inflating oil and gas stocks, basically lying to the public and to investors for El Paso's own benefit. There were several other companies that were involved that were doing the same thing. Those folks who pled guilty, and they're going to do a little time as well. When you have an attorney general who's willing to go after these folks, want to stand up to the oil and gas industry, you can find that there is a lot of corruption, that there is a lot of scurrilous activity going on. I don't know how this guy was stupid enough to get caught, the El Paso guy, because normally, oil and gas guys, they get away with whatever they can. BP is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the BP part too much, but I really think it's important, that everybody knows. We've got the contract. We're not just talking. And this will be up on the site. We'll have a link to it. And, another interesting thing about this El Paso, BP, El Paso, BLM, all these guys that are definitely all in bed with each other. I certainly hope they're not in bed with each other like they were a few years ago, but nothing, after this conversation, George, nothing would surprise me. You know, if you really start digging into this El Paso company, they have literally hundreds, and I mean this, hundreds of other corporations, lots of them offshore, lots of them in the Caymans, which, you know, I've been around the block long enough to know the Caymans are a very favorable place to have shenanigans going on with financials, have shenanigans going on with ownership declarations. But these guys have hundreds of these corporations. And I haven't had the time to dig through to find where BP, if they do, I don't know that they do, but you know, if they're part owner in any of these little corporations that are all part of the Ruby Pipeline LLC, yet another corporation that El Paso created, a British company just fronted them $700 million. Global Infrastructure Partners out of London just fronted El Paso $700 million and got a 50% stake into Ruby Pipeline. I'm going to be looking into those guys. They apparently are all from GE Capital and Credit Suisse. You know, this rabbit hole goes so deep and in so many directions that I would love to ask the membership of AboveTopSecret.com to please look at these documents, listen to what George is saying, and let's put our collective research skills and Google abilities to work. This stuff has to end, you know, and that I want to give you the say whatever it is you want to say to these guys, because you know what, we're wide open. This is AboveTopSecret.com.
Well, you know, we're all students of conspiracy. I love a good conspiracy story as much as the next guy. You know, a lot of it is crap. A lot of it doesn't pan out. This is one that's real. I mean, this is going on now. It has demonstrable effects on the American public, on our environment, on our treasury, and it needs to stop. There needs to be a top to bottom review of how our public lands are managed, because more of it's coming. You know, in addition to the oil and gas industry and the big mining industry and agriculture, you got all these solar and wind proposals for public land. Nevada is ground zero for all that stuff, because we got solar and geothermal and wind potential. But the speculators are already jumping in, gobbling up land, gobbling up prime sites, leasing it for pennies on the dollar of what it's really worth, and sitting on it so that they can be there to exploit the taxpayer once again. There needs to be a total review of how our public lands are managed. And the example being, again, it's an example, it's a symptom, the wild horse program. Yeah. You know, you can't keep wiping them out, taking them off land that is set aside by law to keep them out there to benefit some ranchers. You can't do it. And people should be outraged about how their tax dollars are being spent in that example, about how their tax dollars are being managed in the oil and gas program, about the degree of influence. And it's not a partisan thing. It goes from Democrat to Republican administration. It's both of them. It cuts across all those lines. The degree of influence that big oil and big gas and big mining have on our government, the stranglehold that they have on them.
Yeah, you know, and I can't express how absolutely and completely angry I am about this. The horses, I grew up in Texas. I think any normal, rational human being with a heart loves horses. How somebody could call them a cockroach is beyond me, especially these horses represent Americana to me, the wild Mustang. What is more American than the wild Mustang? I can't think of anything.
Well, literally, they're the horse we rode in on. I mean, the horses allowed us to conquer America, to conquer the West, to tame the West. I mean, the cavalry and the lawmen and the settlers, and I mean, horses and people go way, way back, and a special bond for Americans. And I would like to say that, you know, not everyone in the BLM is a bad guy. I've met a lot of people who really do care about horses, who care about the land, people here in Nevada, but they're not the ones that call the shots. Yeah. It's the big guys that call the shots. People like here in the Alan Shepard is the guy that runs the program in Nevada. He loves horses, but he takes orders. He doesn't give orders, he takes them. And so you got a lot of good people in these agencies who I am sure are just as disgusted as I am with what goes on inside our government.
And, you know, I think this one absolutely positively goes from conspiracy theory to conspiracy fact. And It's not often, like you said, it's not often we can really pull it all together. But these guys are destroying not only, as I said earlier, the culture, forget the livelihood, or the ability to make a living down on the Gulf Coast. These guys are destroying the culture of generations of families who have made their living farming that sea for shrimp, for seafood, for whatever. Number one. Number two, now we've connected them to destroying another piece of Americana, our Mustangs, our wild horses, in conjunction with several other dirty parties. You know, from the ocean to the desert, they're beating on us, and we got to start beating back. I'm Mark Allin. George Knapp, any last words?
Well, I do want to mention where we are. I mean, it's appropriate for us to be talking about oil and gas. We're sitting in the Howard Hughes house.
Yes, we are.
Howard Hughes owned this house. He lived in this house. He owned the TV station where I work. He had a lot of good times here, I would imagine, but it was all fueled by oil money from the drill bit. And I guess it's appropriate that we're here to talk about that. And I sure hope that the American people are angry out there, that they are outraged about what goes on in the Gulf, and that they pay attention to what's going on in their very backyards, because it's everywhere.
For AboveTopSecret.com and ATS News Special Report, Mark Allin and George Knapp, spread the word, tell everybody you know about this video, help us dig up the dirt on these guys, and let's do something. Thanks.